Sherry, I know that especially when people see that this podcast, by way of the title and the description, that we're interviewing someone, I know they're expecting us to start in a very classy, highbrow way.
Or more serious note.
A little bit more than maybe normal.
Yeah.
Which is why I want to introduce people to a new concept called Marjorie's Pimple.
What?
I love this. I love this so much. During one of our sessions of our Echoes of Recovery think tank this week, one of our thought leaders, Marjorie, said resentment processing, which we talk about a lot.
Yes.
She said it's kind of like a pimple. Like you pop it, but then it refills. And then you got to deal with it. I know it's gross, isn't it? I'm sure Lundy is like, God, what have I agreed to?
Yeah.
But you pop it, it refills.
Clean it out. If you don't clean the pore, it's going to refill. So.
Yeah. And eventually, if you take care of it, it will go away.
Yeah, I see.
But the idea that the conversation we were having is that when you're processing resentment or processing trauma, especially when doing so with your partner, and then your partner's like, oh, we already talked about that. Don't ever bring that up again. That's not how it works. No. Sometimes that sucker refills and we got to go back.
Yeah.
We got to go digging around a little bit more. So I am going to add Marjorie's Pimple to my repertoire of unnecessarily disgusting things that I'm going to say on a regular basis. And I always want to give attribution. I actually asked for permission and she said, yes, I'm allowed to name it that. But so if you're working on resentment processing, trauma processing, and your partner keeps coming back and wants to talk about that same thing, like, Sherry, how many thousand times did we talk about your 40th birthday?
Well, I don't think it was 1,000.
I know that sounds very dismissive when I say it that way.
So I'm glad you used that analogy. But we had to talk about it several times because there were things that I didn't realize had been resentful until I felt more comfortable opening up to you and talking to you about some of the major pieces. But then there were small issues throughout the whole weekend that I had to revisit.
There are layers. Well, anytime you want to talk about your 40th birthday, I am prepared. I'm here for you. Listener, I want to let you know that I have never enjoyed interview prep like this. Let me bring our guest into the Untoxicated podcast. Lundy Bancroft started in domestic violence field over 30 years ago at Emerge in Cambridge, Mass. Emerge was the first counseling program for men who abuse women. The vast majority of his direct counseling experience is treating men who abuse women, but contact with the abused women has had a huge impact on him becoming a leader in understanding abuse in relationships. He has authored or co-authored 7 books, including the world's best-selling book on domestic violence titled, Why Does He Do That? Even though he's retired, he has generously offered to let us record an important conversation for our audience. Lundy Bancroft, welcome to the Untoxicated podcast.
Thank you so much.
Lundy, I want to start with your definitions of different forms of abuse, because I think we have listeners who don't think a domestic violence conversation applies to them. And I think your answer to these first questions might change their minds. I've heard you define battery as deliberate steps to put her in physical fear. Would you please explain what that means in contrast to what people probably think of as physical abuse?
Well, I mean, let me take one step back, which is that we live in the United States, and like a lot of modern societies, our tolerance for violence is very high. Like, we won't even tend to think of something as violence unless it's a full-on closed fist, punch in the face. And a lot of things that to me are direct physical violence, shoves, grabs, pinning somebody and, holding them against their will, which I just learned a new term for. It's called something like illegal incarceration or something like that, but the abuser always just says, I restrained her, makes it sound. And then to me, a threat, if it's a threat of physical harm, is an act of physical abuse. Like, to me, that's not verbal abuse. It is also verbally abusive, but it's not, I wouldn't put that in the verbal abuse category if it involves threatening to harm you physically. Like someone who says, you do such and such, you're going to get your ass kicked, or I'm going to kill you someday. The whole point of that is to put you in physical fear. That's the goal.
Right.
And then a lot of things can be unspoken, right? Like towering over someone. And this is something that in particular that men have an option to do to women a lot of times because of their size and certain other issues between the sexes. It's not just a size thing. He'll like tower over her or walk towards her with this kind of look in his eye. This is something you hear a lot from women who've been abused in relationships, is he would give me the look, or he would come walking towards me with the look. They were always talking about the look. And she knows what that means. And she knows it means, if you don't do what I'm telling you to do, or if you keep upsetting me, you could get hurt. And so that's why, to me, all those things belong in the category of physical abuse, that we shouldn't be waiting until it's a punch in the face to define this as violence. And I'm not talking about other definitions of the word violence. I'm talking about physical. These, to me, are physical violence.
Yeah, I think you take it even further than the towering over or the pinning, the restraining. I've heard you say that if somebody says to their partner, "I'm going to dig a grave in the backyard," that is it's a verbal threat. But would you classify that in this same category as well?
Absolutely, it's a threat to kill her. And I guess a lot of how I think about these things is, what is the abusive person's intention? And it's unquestionably, it's to create fear of what he might do to her body. And to create an intimidation, an atmosphere of intimidation. And it works. It's exactly what it'll do. And this is particularly, those kinds of comments are particularly going to have that effect where there's a power imbalance, when a male is doing that to a female, or an adult is doing that to a child, or a boss is doing that to a worker. It's going to be a lot scarier. Now, I mean, those kinds of comments can be frightening in a lot of other contexts too, but they're going to get more frightening in those kinds of circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what about like sleep deprivation? Is that considered a physical violence?
I think it's typically not, but I certainly do. It's an assault on your body.
Okay.
And this is almost never recognized as a form of physical abuse or physical violence. And I'm really glad you asked about that, because it's one of the kinds of mistreatment that I most commonly hear about from women who've been, severely mistreated in a relationship, is not being allowed to sleep. And particularly when that goes on for days on end, you also start to feel kind of psychotic. And then if the guy on top of it is saying you're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy, or the parent is saying you're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy, to a kid, well, you start to feel like, well, maybe they're right, because I am starting to see kind of cross-eyed. And one other thing I like to add about that is that I hear women say a lot of times, after he just wouldn't let me sleep and wouldn't let me sleep, I gave in and let him and allowed him to have sex. Because a lot of times the sleep deprivation can be about a lot of other things, but that's one of the most common things it's about. And I always say to her, no, you didn't allow him to do that. When he was not letting you sleep, that's not allowing him to do that. He forced that by not letting you sleep.
It's like a psychological version of, psychological torture leading to rape. That was actually my next question, was about sexual coercion, because especially, we deal with relationships that have been impacted by alcoholism. And so just like you said, in the people that you've worked with, this sexual coercion is high on the list of types of abuse. That's high on the list of, those are the arguments that lead to over drinking, that leads to more arguing, that leads to this kind of sexual coercion. It's a vicious cycle. Some of these definitions, I think the reason I wanted to start with that is because I think we've drawn a lot of listeners in who might have thought, oh, well, I'm going to skip this week. That conversation's not for me. And they understand that there are so many different ways that through manipulation, psychological tactics, the partners are being abused. How do these definitions, this initial conversation we've had, how does that contrast with what the legal system sees?
The legal system, first of all, in my experience, doesn't tend to even consider things physical violence until they reach the sort of punch in the face kind of level. And if a woman reports being shoved, for example, she's unfortunately is likely to get a response of like, what, you're calling that violence, that he shoved you? You're probably talking to a cop or a judge who's shoved their partner a number of times, and so they're like, of course, that's not the fact that there might be an abuser too isn't a good thing, but
Right.
It's even harder in the civil system, in the child custody system, to get anything less than severe and repeated violence taken in any way taken seriously. And it's very hard to get professionals in these systems to understand the cumulative effects of these things. And you must, in the addictions field, you must deal all the time with how the effects of these behaviors accumulate on the person around them over time, right? It's like it's different if you've been going through this for 5 years than if you've been going through it for 3 weeks. This stuff builds up inside, the people who are being harmed by the destructive person's behavior. And that reminds me that I came more and more in recent years, in very recent years, I wish I'd been on this a lot sooner in my career, to put a lot of emphasis on cruelty. Because to me, in many ways, that becomes the outstanding characteristic of so many of these situations and is so often not being named. And if you ask, well, does the person get cruel to you at times? Well, then a lot of times they'll be, yeah, they do this, they do this, they do this. And it's like, well, then that's cruelty is abuse,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Reading about you, reading your stuff, listening to your interviews, your previous interviews has really been eye-opening to me. I have, for a long time now, I have owned my emotional abuse when I was actively drinking, the way I treated my wife, but I never would have thought that I crossed the line into physical abuse. But like, for instance, when I was drinking and I'm slurring, I'm hurling insults, and Sherry eventually has had enough and she's hurling them back. And then there's like, kind of a loss of control. The thing has spun out of control. There were many times where I held you back, Sherry. And I, in my mind, I was doing that to protect you from hurting yourself or hurting me or taking it too far. I feel like I'm the hero of the story. But the more I learn from your experience, Lundy, you talk about pinning or imprisonment. That's a form of physical abuse. I think I'm the hero because I'm preventing the escalation, but not so much. What about that kind of pinning and imprisonment? I know how you feel about it, but does the legal system have any appreciation for how damaging that is?
Very, very, very difficult. I was just at a training of police officers that I was one of the speakers for in Maryland, and the trainers laid out the scenario with a woman who was in a big argument with her husband and was feeling like she had to get out of the house and was trying to get out of there, and he blocked the door so she couldn't get out, and when she continued to try to get out, he fought her physically, and ultimately she couldn't get out of the house, and a bunch of stuff escalated after that. And ultimately, she ended up in the kitchen holding a knife, and police came and arrested her. Yeah. And what was being discussed in this training was, how do you decide who's the predominant aggressor, which is this term that gets used in the law enforcement world about domestic violence in this incident? And everybody in the audience is stumped. Like, all the police officers are saying, "Wow, yeah, this is really complicated. How are we going to figure out who's responsible for this incident?" When the incident began with her being unable to get out of the house. It's like, if I'm being held prisoner in a house, how are you going to hold me responsible for anything that follows after that? Whatever attempts I make to keep myself safer to get out of that house, to my ethical system, become legitimate. You have no right to if you imprisoned a man in a house, whatever he did to get himself out, including kill people, you would say, well, he was being imprisoned in that house. He did what he had to do to get out.
That's right.
So I think there is the legal system I just watched it happen, like I say, at this training just last week. So the legal system does very much underestimate what the impact is of not being permitted to leave a room or leave a building, leave a dwelling, and how suffocating that is, and what a denial it is of some of your most fundamental rights as an adult human being. So it's an intense experience for the person who's it's almost like being suffocated. It's a really intense experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And that knife in her hand, that just sounds like self-defense to me in the most basic terms. It's right. This is an area where not just the legal system, but society has a lot of catching up to do. for sure.
And where there are tremendous double standards, I might add, because in all kinds of situations where you would take certain kinds of steps to defend yourself, but it wasn't an intimate partner, and particularly when it's a man taking those steps. Actually, I told this story last week to the police about a time when I was assaulted on the street, and I made a few efforts to get away from the person and couldn't get away from the person, and ultimately knocked him down. And I didn't understand what his issue was. And you know, eventually, after it had all calmed down, it became kind of clear that he was mentally ill. But I didn't understand that at the time. I thought he was angry about something I had no idea what was going on. He was after me, at me. I tried to get away from him. He just wouldn't stop. You know, he'd start pounding on my car, and so I couldn't pull out of the parking lot. I mean, it all got crazy. And I finally knocked him down. I just laid him out flat. And not a single person said to me, "Well, Lundy, you got violent too." You know, I never heard that once. It's you know, there's a completely different ethical standard if you're just a person, particularly if you're a man, but really if you're a person trying to defend, but as soon as it's an intimate relationship, it's like, you know, you just, for some reason, as a woman, at least, you've lost your right to defend yourself.
When you tell these stories and you point to the double standard in front of like a group of law enforcement, what kind of reception do you get? Are they curious? Do they understand the points you're making?
Well, you can only hope. I'm sorry to say, it's a really good question, and you can only hope, because they don't, you know, they don't show much in the midst of a training. You don't hear police officers, at least that day, saying, "Oh, wow, that's a really good point," or "Wow, you really made me think." And in every audience, there's usually a couple officers who have more extensive training, or have just, you know, decided they want to be on the right side of this thing, including there's usually male officers in the room who've decided they want to be on the right side of this thing. And they'll speak up, and that's really helpful, because then other officers think, "Oh, well, it's not just this weird trainer from the Northeast, you know, it's like, you know, this person in my own department, or maybe even a supervisor in my department." So, but it's people's attitudes are pretty entrenched. Yeah, that doesn't mean that you don't have any impact when you talk to them. It just means that you have to understand that it's going to take somebody else saying something, and somebody else saying something, and them reflecting on this thing for months or a couple of years, and somebody else saying something, and then, you know, there's some reasonable hope that eventually something's going to click. I mean, it's not. I mean, when we think of our own personal changes, we didn't often make changes overnight in ourselves. You know, things had to rattle around in there for quite a while.
That's right. We use the word evolution around a lot of our topics, and that's exactly why it takes a few go rounds for it to click sometimes. One last like discussion around the topic of defining abuse, and maybe I'm getting into the weeds too much, but I hear you use the word verbal abuse a lot. We primarily talk about emotional abuse, and then of course there's psychological abuse. In my naive mind, those are the same thing. Do you do any parsing out and distinction?
I don't, you know, and I think emotional abuse is a good term. I think cruelty is a good term. I think bullying is a good term. I think those are all good terms. And because you know, there's so many different things. Like there's obviously there's the overt insults and things like you talked about, but then there's just all kinds of cruelty, not letting someone see someone that they love, for example, that kind of cruelty, like, "No, you can't go visit your sick dad in the hospital. I'm not going to let you go," and things like that. Or, "I'm not going to let you talk to your child who's in his room crying, saying you know, mommy, come in to say goodnight." And you know, these are things from actual cases of mine. And then there's, you know, all kinds of financial, you know, mistreatment and exploiting someone economically. And then there's all kinds, you know, so many different kinds of sexual mistreatment. And so to me, yeah, it makes sense to just put, sometimes I often want to talk about sexual mistreatment as a specific thing, because it creates a specific set of injuries. But yeah, the broad category of emotional abuse. And one thing that I mentioned to you when we were corresponding before today was that I have never had a client who was physically abusive who didn't also use lots of emotional abuse. And there's research from a long time ago, actually, showing that the best behavioral predictor of which men will be violent towards their female partners is their level of emotional abuse towards their female partners. And that's really important for us who are parents or just have young friends or whatever, to tell younger people, like, don't be thinking, "Oh, well, it's just verbal abuse," or, "Oh, it's just emotional abuse," because it's like that. First of all, that's going to do more destruction in itself to you than you realize as the years go by.
Right.
It's going to take a bigger toll than you know. But also, that's the best predictor of what whether he's going to turn scary eventually too.
We talk a lot in dealing with alcoholism about the progressive nature of addiction. And I've got to imagine you see the same thing with abuse. What starts as emotional abuse, it just, the perpetrator isn't getting enough satisfaction, or they aren't exerting enough control or whatever, and they just keep winding down until it becomes physical. Is that pretty common?
That's pretty common, and it's, no one wants to be a slave. So the abuser's partner is always going to make periodic attempts to have a life again and have a voice again. The abused children do the same thing, right? They make periodic attempts to have a voice again, or to have some say again over their lives. And so an abusive partner, like an abusive parent, escalates in response to resistance, in response to efforts at freedom. Oppressive governments do that. You try to fight for your freedom, they're going to escalate. That doesn't mean you shouldn't fight for your freedom and that it doesn't sometimes have good effects. I'm just saying the response is, you have to also be prepared for the fact that the response is typically going to be escalation. One way that the abusive partner is a little bit different from the addict or alcoholic is that often it won't just escalate endlessly. Often he'll sort of reach his level and then kind of stay there. But it's an awful, the level is awful. And then other ones, it'll just keep escalating endlessly until the situation is a risk of somebody getting killed. And part of it that I've observed, yes, the dynamics that you described of just, wanting more and more control to try to feel satisfied. But I think another aspect of it is that as human beings, we have certain built-in objections to doing harm to other human beings. So he gets used, in a sense, he gets accustomed to a certain level of harm that he's doing, and then can escalate because he's sort of learned how to wrestle his conscience down to the ground about the complaints from his conscience about him doing this, and that allows him to go up. And then he might struggle a little bit with some internal messages about that, and he, over some months, struggles those to the ground, and then he can escalate from there. And so what we see is that the longer a man's been abusing his partner, the thicker his walls get to having any kind of compassion for what she's suffering. And he may remain a somewhat compassionate individual towards other people, or towards a dog that he sees suffering on the street. He may be Mr. Kind-hearted in other contexts, but his wall to anything about what she's going through just gets thicker and thicker and thicker.
Oh, yeah. And so that's escalation on one end. But I want to highlight, you've said this, but I want to drive this point home. On the other end, the kind of entry level, if you will, verbal abuse, when there's name calling, until our relationship got really healthy, I didn't recognize how unhealthy it was when I thought what we were doing was normal. Like, for instance, I've heard you talk about if you're saying to your wife, "You're fat, you're stupid," and you're doing that on a repetitive basis, that does a lot of damage. So I don't want our listeners to excuse it and say, well, my partner doesn't escalate. They have these few 3 or 4 bones to pick with me, and they do so in a really cruel way, and they do it over and over, but that's okay. This conversation doesn't apply to me. That does damage when it's done on a repetitive basis, doesn't it?
Oh, getting put down is so hurtful. And often we're being put down about things that we're already struggling about. Like kids are often already struggling about whether they're smart or not. And then they've got their parents saying, "You're stupid," or a sports coach saying you're stupid. And it's hitting you where it already hurts. Most people are already struggling with, at least in the modern world, they're already struggling with some extent about body image and wishing we were better looking or thinner or whatever, And so then you got somebody calling you fat or spastic or whatever. Those things, it really hurts. But also, you're making an additional point that's really crucial there, which is that also the more you hear these things, the more they hurt. And the more you start to think, well, the person has said it to me so many times, there must be some truth to it, because it's been said to me 20 or 30 times by this partner or this parent or whatever. And you start to internalize it.
Yeah. We're going to come back to instincts versus insecurities in a few minutes. Now that we've described the full scope of abuse that we will discuss, I want to finish your introduction You've received training in various types of counseling in college, but you didn't want to practice social work. You wanted to work for social change. That's what I want, Lundy. When I heard you say that, that absolutely gave me chills. Did you have a specific target for social change when you knew in your bones that's what you wanted to do? Or did you just want to make an impact and you kind of waited to see how that would evolve?
Yeah, I didn't know where I was going to go with it. I grew up in a Quaker family. So I grew up with this value that you need to put action where your beliefs are. That just believing those things is not enough, because that's really how Quakers tend to think. Like you need to put action behind your beliefs. And so I grew up caring about a lot of justice issues. I grew up caring about war and what war does to people, and invasion. And I grew up caring a lot about what racism does to people. And so there wasn't a particular direction. I remember when I was in college thinking, about what I was going to try to do with counseling skills. I remember thinking, well, I knew there were people that did counseling for draft resistors, but like I knew no one was going to pay me a living to counsel draft resistors. That's like something volunteer counselors do. No one pays you for that. So I had no idea like what, how could you use counseling skills in a more social change oriented? I didn't know if such a thing was really going to turn out to exist. So then when I started to understand that domestic violence was part of how women are kept down, and then happened to learn about abuser counseling programs, I thought, oh, well, this might be a way to like fight for gender justice, and it turned out to be exactly that. It was just a series of stumbles really in my life, and I just happened to stumble into the right place.
I've heard you talk about the fact that when you fight for racial justice, so for instance, when a white person fights for racial justice, no one bats an eye, and they shouldn't, right? I mean, that's an important cause. But when a man is fighting for women's justice, some wonder, I don't know, what's your angle? Like, are you met with skepticism? What have you learned over the years fighting for this cause?
Yeah, I think it's too bad that there isn't more of an expectation of like, yeah, men should get on the right side of this stuff. Like, why wouldn't you, kind of thing. And so, yeah, people are often saying, oh, so was your dad a batterer? And I'm like, no. And so, what got you into this? And I said, I care about what's fair in the world. It's like I mean, I can point to something sort of, and I point to the fact that my real hero when I was growing up was one of my big sisters, but it's like, but that's just one factor among so many. And yeah, and I do wish there was just an expectation of like, yeah, you should find a way in your life to be fighting for the right side of something. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. I think the greatest social revolution of our lifetime, more than all the tech stuff, more than the internet and the smartphones and the AI and the billionaire rocket men, more than any of that is the gender revolution for women. And I pin it, when I talk about it happening in my lifetime, I pin it to the fact that the year I was born, my newly divorced, eventually to be mother-in-law, Sherry's mom, then 28 years old, she had to have her father co-sign on a checking account with her because a woman couldn't possibly be trusted to do math and not bounce checks all over town. And so we've gone from that, the year I was born, to now women have achieved educational independence, financial independence, physical safety independence, intellectual independence, sexual independence. And you've been fighting for that for 30 years. And I commend you. Do you ever, I know I'm laying it on pretty thick here, Lundy. I know I am, but how does that feel to have been part of this social revolution? Like, do you ever reflect on that?
Yeah, and I would say two things about it. I would say that it really feels good to have been an ally. I mean, being an ally to people who are fighting for their rights feels good, and movements appreciate their allies. If they're solid, reliable allies. They also get burned by their allies sometimes. So then they start to really be on guard. And I understand that too. I understand why people start to be a little mistrustful of people who present as allies. But there's also a lot of appreciation for Black people tend to express a lot of appreciation for white allies if they're genuine allies.
Right.
And I've received a lot of appreciation from women about about my work, once they could tell that I wasn't just doing this to create a good impression or whatever, but that I meant, that I really meant what I was saying. It's balanced with however, how many setbacks there have been, and what a complicated process this is. And we live in a period right now where, and I don't just mean Trump, but this goes back before Trump, of a long period of real backlash against women, and a lot of the gains that the domestic violence movement has made, that the battered women's movement has made, have started to be pulled away over the last 10 to 15 years. And the child custody system is just a disaster. It's worse for moms there than it's ever been. And so we've made zero progress there, and it's not for failure to try. So there's just there's just always so much to do. But I resonate with what you say about feeling like, there's this old thing from a poem about the rising of the women means the rising of the race, that I really resonate with. And I have a joke, and you can edit this out if you need to from the podcast, but I always say, when you look at the history of the human race, like, everything went to hell when the men took over. And that was like somewhere between 5 and 10, maybe as much as 15,000 years ago. It's hard to tell exactly how far back it goes, but something like 5 or 10,000 years. It's like, and I'm not saying that people lived perfectly before then, but they lived so much better than we've lived since, and so yeah, I think equality between men and women would be the greatest hope for all of us.
Yeah, I don't want to, swat at a bee's nest, but I've noticed that all of our international warmongers are men. Just saying, I'm just going to leave that there. You talked about child custody, and we would have listeners that would drive to our house and attack us if we didn't go into that with you. That was a terrible phrase.
Yeah.
They wouldn't really attack us. No, but there are people that are very interested.
Very interested. We have some.
In our experience dealing with relationships that are impacted by alcoholism, we meet a lot of women who, one of the reasons they stay in an abusive relationship is because of fear of what the child custody situation is going to yield. But in all of the specific situations that we're intimately aware of, it comes out on the side of the women getting the vast majority of custody, if not sole custody. But that's not your experience, it sounds like.
Not by a long shot. Are these guys mostly really obvious substance abusers, like just undeniably alcoholic? Or, I mean, is it really painfully?
Yeah. And where it goes bad is when the divorce isn't in any way amicable, and the women start to collect text messages and emails, and they start to build a pretty good profile of the kind of behavior that they're up against. So we've seen some situations, and we often talk to people about the fact that that the experiences we've seen are that the custody system has respect for what you've been through, but not always, huh?
No. And it depends a lot on what kind of money the abuser has. If he's got access to a lot of money, either because he's fairly wealthy or he's got wealthy relatives or something, the court system will give him a lot of mileage to just keep creating problems for years. And most abusers, at least the abusers who decide to play the custody card, tend to be pretty well organized. And what I mean by that is that they're not, severely mentally ill. An abuser can be so cruel and quite terrifying, like type terrifying, and not be mentally ill. And if they are, substance addicted, they're able to manage it at a level where they're not like coming to court drunk or getting arrested driving drunk, or it's not, they're functional. And it's actually a real blessing for the woman when the abuser makes really serious mistakes. And so sometimes the really out there, like truly can't control their substance use kind of guy is less likely to get away with it. The court doesn't want something that's going to make them look bad in the newspaper. And often they've also used up their financial resources when they're really severely addicted, at that level. So So I'm glad that the cases that you're tracking, she's managing to come out on her feet more, and my guess is that's part of why. But occasionally, it also depends on what the particular court is that
That's right.
a person is at.
That's right. Do you advise women to document?
I do, although depending on her circumstances, they can even use that against her. They'll say, "Oh, it looks like you're really out to build a case against him." And if she doesn't do that, they'll say you don't have any evidence, so she can't win. It's a very gender biased system. But it is best to go ahead and collect information. Whether she wants to let that be known or not is a strategic decision. But I also recommend that she try to find out everything she can about the particular court she's dealing with, because it's so court specific. What have been other women's experiences or other parents who really needed to protect their children from a destructive parent, but it's typically women that we're talking about. And what do they know? What's known about how the judges at that court respond, and try to go in there with information about the specifics of that situation.
I've never thought of it this way, but a woman who's being at least emotionally abused, where there's alcohol as well, alcohol abuse, alcoholism. I've never thought of the alcoholism as a benefit, but it sounds like it is, being able to layer that on top of the emotional abuse. I mean, God, I won't go so far as to say alcoholism is an asset, but if that's your situation, it sounds like the pointing to the alcohol abuse might be helpful in the custody realm.
It's bizarre, but the truth is, in the family law system, the alcoholism counts in a way that domestic abuse doesn't.
Yeah.
And particularly if it uses up the financial resources, that's a great thing, because he can't fight you for 10 years if he doesn't have any money to do it with. But what the lawyers and custody evaluators, and they have so many different roles now. They have what's called, they have guardians ad litem, they have parenting coordinators, they have reunification therapists. The roles have just been multiplying, and everybody's just making a fortune off of these cases. And it's not at all uncommon for a woman to say, "I've spent $200,000 on my custody case." That's not at all uncommon.
Yeah.
I used to be shocked when I heard that figure, but I'm not anymore. And so this is a real cash cow. So all these professionals are realizing that they can make unbelievable amounts of money off these cases. And they work in the same circles. They play golf with the judges. They come out often. They are lawyers. The lawyers often know, since judges are lawyers, they know each other from, it's from a whole realm. And so, yeah, it's a system that really needs to be completely investigated and cleaned up bottom up. So,
wow.
But the main practical thing is that a protective mother who's got to worry about whether her children are safe with the other parent, has got to be really strategic. So keep thinking strategic.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I want to talk about anger a little bit. Anger is often associated with abuse on the part of the abuser. I've heard you say he doesn't have a problem with his anger. He has a problem with her anger. Can you explain what you mean by that?
What I mean is that he doesn't believe she has the right to be angry at him. And he believes there's one of the benchmarks of abuse is double standards. So it's one of the things I really recommend people keep an eye out for, because this is something you can often see early in a relationship before you've gotten in too deep, and because it's much harder once you're in really deep, is watch for a person who's got completely different rules for you about certain things than they have for themselves. And like, you're not supposed to have friends of the opposite sex. Would apply to a heterosexual couple, but it's fine for them to have friends of the opposite sex. Or you're not allowed to yell, but it's fine for them to yell. Or you're not allowed to be angry, but it's fine for them to be angry. And because an abuser always insists that he has a right to be angry, but he'll tend to really punish her and retaliate against her for being angry. But the other thing I tend to really emphasize is, or encourage people to do, is just start noticing how many really harmful things he did while he was not angry. And I just had a revelation about this like a week ago, believe it or not, because of a book I'm currently writing. Is I just realized that his anger and his abusiveness tend to arise at the same time because they're both caused by the same other thing. And that makes it look like the anger is causing the abusiveness when that's not why they're coming together. They're both being caused by his severe entitlement, his severe sense that she should have to obey and should have to do everything that he wants. That's making him angry and it's making him abusive. And that's why they come together. And then you start to think, oh, he's being abusive because he's angry. And then you point out, yeah, but how about the time that he, read your private journal? Like, he wasn't angry while he was doing that. How about the time that he checked the mileage on the odometer in the car and then said, no, you didn't go where you said you went. The car's gone 10 miles farther than that. It's like, that's not anger. That stuff is calculated. It's thought out. It's strategic on his part. And so another one of my catchphrases is, he's not abusive because he's angry. He's angry because he's abusive. And what I mean by that is the abusive man has these attitudes that a woman is supposed to like do everything for him. And if you have those attitudes, you're going to be pissed off because she's going to be periodically attempting to have a life. And that's going to make you mad and have a voice and be a person. And that's going to piss you off. And that's what I mean when I say he's angry because he's abusive. He's angry because he thinks the way an abuser thinks. And that makes you mad. That makes him mad.
Yeah, the anger is a co-result as opposed to the cause.
Right.
I love the way you talk about that.
That only just hit me. And then one other thing was I had somebody in my audience about 3 years ago. I wish I'd heard this 30 years ago say, abusers are experts at managing their anger. You shouldn't send them to anger management. And I realized, whoa, that's so true. They can turn it on when they want it on, and they can turn, soon as they're in front of other people or want to create a certain impression or whatever, boom, they turn it off. It's like, oh, somebody should have said that to me decades ago.
Yeah. Oh, so true. So true. Okay, Lundy, I was raised in a pretty typical Gen X patriarchal family. My dad made the money. My mom took care of the kids. My dad made all the big decisions. There was no physical abuse in my family. I was not conditioned to that. But what role does just that patriarchal conditioning play in situations that eventually result in abuse?
Well, that kind of model of how things should be becomes a real problem when people start to believe that's how they must be. And so, for example, I don't think there's any big problem in believing that the man should be the breadwinner and the woman should work in the house and raise the children. Where it becomes a problem is when the woman says, except I don't feel like doing that anymore. And then rather than thinking, oh, well, I guess we have to make some adjustments, or geez, I guess our values clash, maybe we can't be a couple or whatever, the abuser goes to what I call enforcement. And I think that's really what another filter for thinking about what abuse is all about is it's about enforcement. It's not only about what he believes, but it's about the fact that he believes in his right to enforce his beliefs. And so when she starts to say, no, actually, I don't want you to have the last word. I actually want to have say in this decision that you've been making for the past 5 years. Or no, I actually am tired of you always controlling the finances. I actually, from now on, want to be in on what's going on with the finances. Or no, I don't want to be in the effing house all the time. It's making me crazy. I got to be out of here more of the time. Then do you start to redefine how things are going to be done in the family to accommodate the fact that she doesn't want that her values are changing? Or do you instead go to enforcement because you don't want to change how it's going? And the abuser goes to enforcement.
Yeah.
So when people say, well, is the problem religion or is it abuse? Or is the problem culture or is it abuse? I always say, well, is there enforcement?
Yeah.
If there's enforcement, then religion isn't the problem. Abuse is the problem. If there's enforcement, then culture isn't the problem. Abuse is the problem.
Yeah. Oh, I love the way you talk about that. 40% of men who abuse grew up in abusive homes following this conditioning thread. That seems low to me. Does that seem like, do you get that reaction? that 60% of them are first-time abusers, that surprises me.
So I was actually just talking about this at this police training, because I was saying, on the one hand, 40% is a lot. On the other hand, it's not even half, right? And so where are these other 60% learning these attitudes and learning these behaviors, since they didn't learn it from their dad or stepdad? And so in running abuser groups, we get a lot of clues about this, because in an abuser group, a properly run abuser group, these guys are being called out on their stuff. This is not a support group. And when they're called out on their behaviors and called out on their attitudes, they get upset and they start to come back with their excuses and their justifications. And often those justifications reveal how they learned this stuff and where they learned it from. So we end up finding that they're often making references to other men in their family tree, uncles, grandfathers, whatever, with comments like, but this is the way it's always been, And so that's one place they point to. Another place they point to is pornography. Well, the women in pornography like it. It's like, then we have research showing that their peers during their teen years are really important. That abusers have much more tendency than other guys to have hung out during their teen years with guys who were physically abusing women or sexually assaulting them, or just talking approvingly, making jokes about those kinds of behaviors, or making it sound like it's okay to behave in those kinds of ways. So they learn it from peers. And then another thing that you hear a fair bit in the abuser group is sentences that start with, everybody knows that. Like, everybody knows that a woman should do this, or everybody knows that men need sex in ways that women don't, and just this other absurd stuff, but they'll say everybody knows it. Well, those sentences that start with everybody knows that tips me off to things that are just rampant through modern culture. In other words, these things are in movies, these messages are in fairy tales, these messages are in popular songs, in hit music. And so you don't, unfortunately, these kinds of messages are so rampant that you don't have to learn them at home. A lot of these guys learn it at home, but unfortunately, there's a lot of other places to learn it. This was something that was very striking for me when I came into the field, when I was in my mid-20s. Suddenly, I just started to see this stuff all over the place in ways that I hadn't seen it. And I was, when I'd only been doing the work for a couple of years, I went out to a movie with a couple of very aware, like progressive, social worky type friends of mine who were in, human service kind of fields, and like these, what you would call super conscious, aware, caring, sensitive people. And we watched this movie about this very troubled, destructive painter. He was an artist. And but it was, it was really well done. But they, afterwards they said, so what do you think about this movie? And I said, well, I thought it was good. I thought it was really well done. But I honestly, I don't really need to be out at a movie about domestic violence in my off hours, And they said, well, he was kind of a jerk, but it's really interesting that you would use the term domestic violence. Like, did he really strike you as someone who would actually use violence against her? He had, at least twice and maybe 3 times in the movie, grabbed her physically, pinned her, locked her in rooms. And I realized, like, people just don't even see this stuff. It's so normalized. And I wouldn't have seen it. And now suddenly I was just seeing it all over the place.
Yeah. We often talk about, if you've seen, you can't unsee what you know. Like, if you know it, you can't unsee it. But you're right, it is everywhere in lyrics to songs. And I remember, we were the MTV generation, some of those derogatory videos.
Well, the hit
against women and
John Travolta movies, Saturday Night Fever, right?
Yeah.
A woman gets raped in the back of a car in that movie and goes on to be friends with the guys who raped her. Yeah. And when we saw it in the 70s, nobody blinked an eye about it. But when you see it now, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. But unfortunately, totally believable.
And kids absorb this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. How often is alcohol abuse or other substances how often when you treat men who are perpetrators of violence, how often is substance abuse related?
Not as much as you would expect, and certainly not as much as the stereotypes are. It's interesting. The research is kind of unclear on this. Research, obviously every research study tends to find slightly different statistics on any subject. But if you look at multiple research studies, the statistics tend to start to sort of cluster around a certain area. But the research on what the overlap is between domestic violence and alcohol abuse never seems to cluster around anywhere. It's the most wild spread of studies you ever saw. When I was reviewing that research, I was like, whoa, what do we conclude from this? But what I conclude from our case experience with all the abusers I've worked with is that there are a couple of key things to understand. First of all, the abuser who is alcohol involved or addicted in some other way, but the most common addiction in our clients was alcoholism, is equipped with a new excuse, and that's really worrisome because he's like, oh, I was drunk. I was drunk when I did that, and that's an excuse that a lot of people will accept. His friends will accept, and to some extent, the woman will accept it. The woman is often saying to me, well, he's really only done, he really only does this stuff when he's drunk. And to say, well, how about the name calling? Does that ever happen when he's sober? And this and this and this. And you start to find, oh no, he was doing a lot of that other stuff when he was sober. But she thinks of it because the worst stuff happens when he's drunk. She thinks of it as somehow it only happens when it's drunk. And until she starts to be helped by someone to connect that all the emotional abuse is part of the deal, and all the lower level cruelty, then the put downs, all this kind of stuff we've talked about today, that's all part of it. That until someone helps her see that or shows her the power and control wheel, which is an incredible resource. If you haven't seen that, I really recommend checking out the power and control wheel. And we recommend that to listeners, something you can find easily online. She starts to think, oh yeah, there's a lot of this stuff happening when he's sober. But it's an excuse. So that's something to be aware of about it. Secondly, an active alcoholic will never deal with his abusiveness. So unless he gets really seriously sober, he's never going to deal with how he's treating you. On the other hand, the fact of him getting sober in itself isn't going to make him deal with how he treats you either. And we have so many abusers who are, now great in their sobriety and are just the same bullies and jerks they were before. And so it's him getting sober. What that does is get him to the starting block. Then he finally can start to deal with his abusiveness if he chooses to do that work. But it's a different piece of work. And you can't treat abusiveness as an addiction. It has certain things in common and certain ways that it's very different from an addiction. And so you can't treat them as being the same thing, even when they come together. This is something a lot of judges don't understand. I remember a judge saying to me directly during a judicial training, well, once I discover that a guy is alcohol involved, then I know that that's the real issue. So then I focus on getting him sober. And I have to say to the judges, that is a serious issue, but it's not the real one. They're both real, And then the last thing that I really like to draw people's attention to is every research study that's been done on domestic abusers who kill finds that there's that heavy substance involvement, particularly where it approaches the level of daily, or near daily intoxication with alcohol or drugs, is one of the top risk factors for which abusers will kill. So it has to be taken very, very seriously, not as a cause of the abuse, but as a huge danger factor and as a huge cement in the system. It's going to make sure he doesn't change.
Wow. That last part was so impactful. Sherry and I have said for years, sobriety doesn't fix anything, but it is a prerequisite. And it sounds like that mirrors your experience. Got to get this out of the way before we can work on the other wounds. The real,
Absolutely.
They're both real issues, as you said. I know you work with men who have abused women. What percentage of the overall abuse does that cover? I mean, I know there's same-sex, intimate partner violence, there's women on men, but this is the vast majority of the abuse that's out there, isn't it?
It's the overwhelming majority because straight people are the overwhelming majority, first of all. And there's much less research done on same-sex abuse. There's a way, way smaller number of studies. So it's hard to really have a clear picture on what goes on there. The studies that have been done, though, suggest that the rates of domestic abuse in same-sex relationships are not that different, and that the severity or dangerousness doesn't seem to be that different. So don't take it less seriously because your partner is the same sex that you are. And everything I've talked about how you learn it from the society, those models of what it means to be in a relationship. I actually was asking a lesbian about this once when I was saying, like, who was talking about abuse between lesbians. And I was asking her, like, so much of what we see is about these male attitude towards female. How do women learn to do this kind of stuff to each other? And she said, well, we're still growing up with that heterosexual model of a relationship. We're still growing up with the notion that there's one person above and one person below. And it's just less clear among two women which one it's going to be. and the assumption of the same thing happening with gay men. So if you're in a same-sex relationship, don't be any less careful about your well-being and your safety. And the thing about a woman who's really chronically mistreating a man who's not an abusive guy is that first of all, it's hard for her to put him in severe physical fear. She can do it, but it requires a more special set of circumstances for her to be able to do that. I dealt with a case once where the woman was connected to organized crime and could have him beaten up. Well, that would intimidate me.
Yeah.
But in a way, I would say that's the exception that proves the rule, because you see that she had to have something really special at her disposal to be able to create the sort of opposite power imbalance. Another time a man was in a wheelchair, that's the kind of thing that can create the opposite power imbalance. But the other thing is that the guy that abuses women turns out by research to be surprisingly normal psychologically. They don't tend to have nearly as distinctly different a psychology, in their emotional world, in other words, and what's going on in their hearts from non-abusive men. A little bit, according to the research, but not this huge difference like you would expect. What the research finds is the difference is almost entirely in their minds, in their values and attitudes about what a relationship is supposed to look like and what their rights are to enforce and what a woman is supposed to do for a man. Whereas when you get these violent females involved with a non-violent male, you seem to find a lot of really serious trauma and really serious mental health problems. It's not well researched. I'm not speaking from solid research base, but just from what I've observed and from what other people have observed in case circumstances. So it can require a somewhat different response. It doesn't mean that things are necessarily going to be a lot better. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily a much bigger chance that she'll change, but it just means you're going to be dealing with a different set of dynamics. I just always want to caution people, though, about the fact that abusers are so good, and they've gotten better as the years have gone by, in presenting themselves as victims and learning what language to use. And I can reasonably say, and it would be a longer discussion how I know this, but I can reasonably say that about 8 out of 10 guys claiming that they're victims of a violent female are the aggressor in that relationship, not the victim in that relationship. That doesn't mean immediately start treating the person as the aggressor, because he might not be. He might be genuinely involved with a violent female. It just means don't too quickly hop on his side of the story either. Like, move in a little more cautiously and try to be really careful to learn about the situation so that you're not getting manipulated by someone who's actually the one in power in that relationship. Just move cautious. Learn a lot.
Yeah.
Learn a lot.
That's so interesting. What an awesome answer to that question. Very thorough. Entitlement versus trauma. Such interesting stuff we're learning. After our sponsorship break, we're going to get into the details of why abuse happens. And we're going to hit Lundy with kind of a lightning round to test some of our theories against his experiences. We are sponsored by SoberLink. SoberLink is the premier remote alcohol monitoring system combining cutting-edge technology with compassionate design to support accountability in recovery and family law. I want to talk about planning and preparation and how the fine folks and their stellar product at SoberLink fit into a conversation around getting prepared. I'm thinking back to your birthday, Sherry, just a few weeks ago. Do you remember those awesome oatmeal dill pickle cookies with paprika powdered sugar icing the boys and I made you for your birthday?
Oh, how could I ever forget? So no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to forget it. It does come up in conversation a lot. And when I see something gross, I think of those. But I'm going to have to ask Lundy if there's a taste bud abuse.
I do aim to be memorable. I don't just whip a masterpiece recipe like that out of thin air. I had to do research.
Ooh.
I looked at so many recipes that claimed to be unique and special before I found that one. And then I had to gather the ingredients that didn't seem to fit together, like sugar and pickles.
Dill pickles.
Yeah. The point is, making you a special birthday treat didn't start on your birthday.
Are you sure? Because it kind of felt like that. And that it lacked some thought and some preparation or planning or discernment or the slightest clue about my likes and dislikes.
Well, no matter what you think, I actually had that recipe hidden as a surprise for over a month.
Ooh.
I looked at it from time to time to confirm that it would be enough of a surprise.
I found it.
Were you surprised, Sherry?
Oh, unpleasantly surprised.
Preparation and planning is so important whenever you are introducing something new into a relationship. That's why we are proud to partner with SoberLink and so pleased to share with you their offer to help you plan and prepare while you decide if your relationship or co-parenting situation would benefit from an alcohol monitoring system. Right now, SoberLink is offering Untoxicated podcast listeners a free offer ID valid for a $100 enrollment bonus if and when your preparation and planning leads to a decision to implement alcohol monitoring.
So that's a $100 enrollment bonus for SoberLink's best-in-class service and product combination with a built-in facial recognition and tamper detection and expert in-house support. That's email daily, weekly, or monthly reporting. That's all court admissible in 50 of our states in the US and Canada. So unlimited testing days and scheduled testing to build accountability and trust.
Enroll when and if you are ready. But right now, while the offer is still available and while you are in preparation and planning mode, grab one of SoberLink's offer IDs for Untoxicated podcast listeners for a $100 enrollment bonus. There has never been a better time to check out SoberLink.
And so that's on top of the fact that SoberLink now allows new customers to pay monthly service charge as low as $19 a month with qualifying monitoring plan. And so rather than a big pay upfront cost to purchase the device.
Claim your offer ID for a $100 enrollment bonus. There is no commitment required to claim your offer ID while this promotion lasts. And you can use your $100 enrollment bonus when you are ready to place your order. To claim your offer ID, you'll only be asked to provide your name and email address, no personal details, no commitment, and no credit card number. To claim your offer ID for your $100 enrollment bonus, please go to soberlink.com/untoxicated. We are supported by Defining You. We all know how deeply alcoholism impacts not just the drinker, but the people who love the drinker the most. Living with someone struggling with alcohol can take a toll on your own health and well-being, and it's easy to lose yourself in the process.
But your health and wellness matter too. And Kathy, with Defining You, knows this firsthand. When her world became uncontrollable, Kathy's health seriously was impacted. And now 3 years later, she has taken back her health and is helping others who often put themselves last.
Kathy is helping people who have had their health impacted by stress and trauma to feel stronger, healthier, and more at peace. Defining You is not only a podcast covering a variety of topics based on real-life experiences, but Kathy also offers wellness coaching programs to help loved ones of alcoholics reclaim their energy, confidence, and joy. She gets what you are going through, and together, through simple, personalized programs, Kathy helps shift your focus on restoring balance, improving your sleep, losing weight, boosting your energy, and helping you feel like yourself again, even in the middle of life's challenges.
So your health and peace of mind matter, and taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's essential. And you don't have to stay stuck in survival mode. You can rise, heal, and thrive.
If you're ready to feel better inside and out, email Kathy at definingyouconnection@gmail.com to schedule a complimentary consultation. You can also find Kathy and Defining You on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Listen to the Defining You podcast everywhere you find your podcasts. All right, let's get into.
All right, so wait.
Yeah.
Is there? This is a serious question from our joke about the dill pickle. I mean, I would assume that there are some controlling issues that abuser uses too. That also could be about like food restriction and sort of that entrapment or.
Yeah, I mean, the most common thing is interfering with her ability to eat because he wants her super thin, and that gets really destructive, particularly during pregnancy, where a woman's got to gain a lot of weight to have a healthy pregnancy, and so yeah, there's a lot of that's what I most see is constantly, oh honey, that's a lot of calories and all this kind of crap, and just like on her and on her and on. Yeah.
That's awful. But maybe I could find a market for my oatmeal dill pickle sugar cookies.
I gotta be honest. Yeah, they really weren't that bad. They really weren't. You just need to be a better baker. I think they would have been better had I made the recipe, but anyhow. Okay.
Little humble brag in there. I like it. Let's get into the mind of the abuser. Lundy, I've heard you say that men in an abuse program who are super eager about the teachings and like really get into it, they are as unlikely to change as men who reject the program altogether. And the kind of middle ground, the people who are curious but cautious, they're the ones that make lasting change. Are eager beavers just like manipulating the therapists like they manipulate the women in their lives?
That's what I mostly assume. He's learned how to read people. He's learned how to figure out what people want to say. That's a lot of how he gets his relationships, right? Is by being someone who reads a woman well, figures out what she's going to want to hear, and tries to make himself be what she would want him to be. And then a lot of times he's also kind of isolated her from other people by knowing what other people want to hear and how to turn people against her. So he's often a good reader of people in a very unfortunate way. So he goes into an abuser program. Sometimes he starts to learn the language of the abuser program, and he starts to figure out how to please us. And then, yeah, we get guys at the other end of the spectrum who just say, you're full of it. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't care what she did. It only matters what we did, and you're just making money off this, as if people make a bunch of money from running an abuser program. And what I think the reason that the best chance is the guys that are in the middle who are fighting, in other words, they're fighting us, but they're not fighting us so much that they're not hearing anything, is that they're being real. And like, if he had that much capacity to take in her perspective, which is what we're presenting as abuse counselors, is essentially her perspective. In effect, that's what we're doing. We're trying to approximate what we suspect is her perspective. If he were that open to hearing from it and learning about it and realizing how he'd affected her, well, he wouldn't be an abuser, right? Because he would have realized a long time ago what impact his behavior was having on her at the multiple times that she has tried to tell him what impact. So I unfortunately, I didn't get that when I was new to abuse counseling. So I used to really fall for those guys because I thought, oh, he's really changing. And they get pretty slick. They start to say things like, wow, this must be a really hard line of work that you're in. And, sort of flattering things like that. Or God, if I'd learned this stuff 10 years ago, I wouldn't have made a lot of the mistakes I've made in my life, and things like that. They make you think, oh, wow, I'm quite a counselor, and think you're really getting through. And so it took me a lot of, fortunately, the program that you named at the beginning, which is where I did most of my work, and a couple of other programs that I helped out in. We always insisted on having telephone contact with the woman. And those were confidential conversations. He wouldn't know what she told us, but it would guide our work, even though he wouldn't know what she told us. And I noticed that my sort of stellar clients, I was never getting good reports on from the woman. And that's what finally woke me up. Like, nope, those guys aren't moving any more than the guys that are overtly dug in. And I'm not saying that all the guys in the middle move, but if they do move, those are the ones in the middle are the ones that do.
When I've heard you talk about the telephone contact that you have with the women, that seems so basic and fundamental to me. Are there abuse programs that don't have that component? And is that something you would advise people to stay away from? It seems like the counselor having the full view of what's going on is just basic.
It's really basic. Of course, you have to be really careful that you don't let the abuser know what you know, because that'll blow up in her face. But although sometimes she really wants him challenged about certain things, and then I might say, well, are you sure it's worth it? Because it might blow up in your face. And she'll say, no, tell him I said that. And I respect her. I mean, I think she has the right to make that decision. But unless she's like, I want you to talk to him about this, you never tell him what you've heard from her. But it's a wake up. It shapes so much what you do. It keeps you from getting lulled to sleep. And I've been lulled to sleep over and over again. And thank heaven for these contacts with these women to wake me up, because they're convincing. And around Emerge, we used to say, I never met a batterer I didn't like. And they're they know how to function, and most with occasional exceptions. And so yeah, I think programs that are not hearing the woman's story are likely doing more harm than good. You just, because these guys are persuasive, and they never seem as bad, like they could possibly be as bad as they actually are. They always seem much more reasonable, much more sensitive, much more thoughtful, much calmer. You can't believe they could be that bad until you hear what actually happened.
Yeah, I know that abuse and addiction are not the same thing, but what you're talking about here,
they have some commonalities.
Well, and one of them is this keeping up appearances. Our house was more pristine. Our yard was more pristine when I was drinking than it is now, because now I don't really care what anybody thinks about me. But back then, I had to make sure nobody thought there was any problems over here.
Yeah.
And so,
the sagging fence might allude to a problem. And now if our fence panel fell over, you'd be like, okay, whatever. But I think it's that high functioning alcoholic that we kind of like see more in our, and it sounds because they have so much like control, quote unquote control in their lives to have that outward appearance. It sounds like that's also very on par with an abuser, that, outwardly they don't look like they would do that.
They work hard. They typically work hard on their public image. Yeah.
Nothing to see here. What's the rehabilitation success rate in your line of work?
It's really hard to tell, because there's so many different ways of measuring. There's studies that look at whether he's rearrested in the next 12 months. Well, that tells you almost nothing, because he's almost every violent abuser has had other 12-month periods when he didn't commit any assaults. I mean, that's typical. They're not like violent every Friday. I mean, those guys do exist, but they're really rare. Much more commonly is like the actual overt like criminal violence every couple years. The 12-month period would not be. I'm sure he's had almost always has had previous ones, and so it's a little hard to measure. So then when you're going by his report, that tells you very little. So really, you have to interview the woman, and if he's not still in the same relationship, then that, so it's not easy to tell. But what the research does suggest is that one time through an abuser program has about the same effectiveness as one time through other kinds of programs for behavioral problems. So one time through an alcohol program, one time through a sexual offender program, one time through a weight loss or smoking cessation program. Well, we know that one time through any of those programs doesn't have a very high success rate. And yet we still consider those programs really valuable. And so I think the abuser program that's well run is really valuable, but it does not have a very high rate of success from guys going one time through it. And there's a lot of need for courts to be willing to require guys to go, for a couple of years, not to go for 4 months or 6 months, or 8 months.
I've heard you talk about the fact, this is fascinating, that relapse can come from success. If she feels more comfortable and speaks her mind because the power dynamic is equalizing, he feels compelled to take back the power and control, and therefore abuses. He feels like, why bother if I'm in this balanced relationship, I can't get my way anymore. Why am I going through all of that? Does the abuser ever recognize benefits from stopping the abuse?
Yes, yes. There are benefits to him of stopping the abuse, but the problem is they don't come soon. What comes for the first, let's say he's really making some really significant changes. What's going to come for the first 6, 12 months, maybe a couple of years, is that mostly things are going to get harder because she's going to start to, try to get her rights back. And that's going to complicate his life. His life is going to get more difficult. And because the abuser's mentality is what counts in this relationship is how well it works for me, not how well it works for both of us. His mentality is what counts how well it works for me. Then he thinks like, well, this isn't working well. I'm being less abusive. I should be getting rewarded for that. She should be grateful to me that I'm not.
There's that entitlement again.
That's entitlement, right? She should be grateful that I'm not doing these things that I used to do and that I'm not quite as bad as I used to be. And instead she's being more difficult. And so what's the point? And the rewards are going to be 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line. The rewards are going to be, he starts to discover what it actually is like to be in an equal relationship that actually involves some genuine closeness. He's going to have some increase in his self-respect. He's going to discover what it's like I mean, any couple's going to argue. They're still going to have some arguments, but not to be having these intensity of the escalation and these horrible scenes that they always had. That's way down the road. And first of all, we live in an instant gratification culture, but secondly, the abuser is particularly an instant gratification kind of person. I suppose that would have an overlap with substance abuse also. And so it's interesting because in the early days of abuser programs, we used to talk to the guys about what's in it for him to change. And I stopped doing that because I realized those rewards are so far down that if his motivation is what's going to be in it for him, that's just going to make him less likely to change. And I started to notice that the abusers who made serious changes did it because they developed some ability to care about the harm that they were doing and wanted to stop doing that harm. And the ways that it benefited them were like a side benefit that they discovered later down the road.
I love that you pinned that at a couple, 2, 3 years. What we have found when we're working with people on relationship recovery is the trust rebuilding. That is a multi-year process. And the nervous system regulation can be, long-term as well. And so the benefits are way down the road. Our experience just totally overlaps with yours. I want to end, we teased this earlier. We teased instincts versus insecurities. That's something we talk a lot about. Let's end the conversation there. We meet a lot of women who have been exposed to alcohol abuse and in many cases, most cases, also emotional abuse, at least. They have completely lost self-esteem that has been eroded. And so that loss of self-esteem results in them not being able to trust themselves. So if you think of instincts and insecurities on a balance scale, the insecurities are just through the roof. And so they're so easily manipulated and subjected to gaslighting and Darvo and all of these things. Does that fit with your experience? Are those insecurities just really, really difficult?
It completely fits with my experience. And I always say the biggest obstacle to getting away from an abuser is the abuse. What I say to people is, all right, imagine that you're trying to get out of a relationship that isn't abusive. You're trying to leave a relationship for all the other reasons that people leave relationships. You're not getting along, you're not compatible, the sexual relationship isn't working, whatever it is, you're sick of each other, whatever it is. What do you need? Well, you're going to need money because living separately is going to almost always cost more than living together. You're going to need to believe in yourself that you're capable of finding somebody else because nobody wants to be single for the rest of their days. You're going to have to believe in your own competence because to go live as a single person, you're going to have to be running more things and making more decisions. You have to have people to talk to. Because the decision to leave a relationship is such a hard, complicated decision. How are you going to make that decision if you don't have people to talk to about what your thinking is as you get to the point of making that decision? So the abuser is taking away from you exactly the key elements you need to leave any relationship. So it's actually harder to leave an abuser than to leave the relationships we leave for other reasons, because you're losing the elements that you need to get out of a relationship. And this is something people just so misunderstand. I'm so often hearing from people, well, I could see staying in a relationship that was really messed up, but somebody ever raised a hand to me, I'd be out of there. And so they're thinking of it backwards. They think it would be easier to leave a relationship because of the person's abusiveness. And I end up having to say to them, no, it's harder to leave a relationship because of the person's abusiveness. And you just put your finger on it when you talked about the damage that's been done to her self-esteem. And that's just one part of it.
Yeah. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on his self-esteem. When we meet alcoholics, alcohol is a maladaptive coping mechanism. Alcoholics are treating low self-esteem. The thing they've chosen to treat it with just has all these terrible side effects, and that's why we call it maladaptive. But usually there are underlying issues, and self-esteem is just woven through it all. We just don't feel good about ourselves, so we drink. Is low self-esteem a driving factor in men who commit abuse as well?
That's one of the places where the two diverge, is that it doesn't turn out to be a very big factor in dealing with domestic abuse, and trying to build up the abuser's self-esteem doesn't help at all. And we get so many guys who are like top of the world guys. Their professional life is going great. They're super popular in town. They're making good money. And so it's not nearly the kind of factor that we thought it was. I mean, I still think it's in there somewhere, but it just doesn't seem to be any bigger than it is for other men, for non-abusive men. But it doesn't have to be more than for non-abusive men to still maybe be playing some degree of role in their ability to ever get recruited to this mentality in the first place. So even if the mentality is the main problem, you might still say, yeah, but what made him recruitable to that mentality? And so it may to some extent be in there somewhere, but definitely not as big a force as you're finding within the substance abuse field.
One last question. I'm wondering if we are in a situation where there is hope, and it's not just hope because of wonderful people like you that are treating people and creating change, but if there's just a generational aspect to this. We talked about the conditioning that's involved. One of the things that we see in emerging generations, younger generations, is that they drink less. It seems to me, we talked about how we're in a period of backslide. So maybe, I don't know how you're going to answer this, but it seems to me like misogyny and patriarchy are things that have the potential to just get weeded out of our society. So could the problems of abuse, to at least some extent, fizzle with more enlightened young people? Do you hold hope like I do?
I do hold hope, but the sense of sort of hope in sort of gradual cultural change is, I don't put huge hope there. I have some hope there, but I don't have huge hope there. It just has to do with my own reading of history, where I feel like change has really come primarily through organizing. And when you're trying to deal with oppressive systems, you can't really fight them alone, and you can't really fight them through just changing people's thinking about things. You tend to have to organize. And each new generation also develops new ways of organizing. There's a lot of interesting organizing happening among young people now about the climate, about certain gender justice issues. And there's not nearly enough. And that's sort of like grassroots organizing really has to come much more back to life, and a sense of like collectivity has to come much more back to life, because that's one of the counter trends, unfortunately, is the society is becoming lonelier. It's becoming more separate. People are talking to each other less, spending less time together. And so that's one of the trends we really have to fight against. In the domestic abuse world, I notice how there's just not nearly as many support groups for abused women as there were when I came into the field, where those groups were all over the place. Now it's all moved towards almost all moved towards individual counseling. Well, for my first, at least 10 years in the field, the support group was what I most heard about from abused women. Like, this is what made the difference in my life, was the support group. And why has that been phased out towards individual counseling? Well, I'd have to give you a longer explanation of my understanding of how that's come about, but it's a mistake. And so I keep in emphasizing that we have to think collectively. One of my more recent books, The Joyous Recovery, which is talking about not recovery in the alcohol sense, but emotional healing in general. I'm talking about just recovery from trauma. Is I'm saying the society is putting way too much emphasis on self-help, and we have to be thinking much more about how do we work collectively, how do we work together in pairs and in threes and in groups towards emotional healing. And yeah, so I just think we have to keep pushing in a collective thinking direction.
Oh, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Lundy, Robin Williams defined addiction as when your behavior deteriorates faster than you can lower your behavioral self-standards. Likewise, I think our society has changed faster than our culture's ability to catch up. Lundy Bancroft, you have been a powerful agent of cultural change for over 3 decades, and we thank you for sharing your experience and your mission on the Untoxicated podcast. What are you looking for in a relationship? What would be attractive in a partner? Please take our survey on attraction and relationship dynamics at stigmasurvey.org. We particularly need survey participants in the age 18 through 29 range. All relationship statuses, sexual orientations, gender identities, and ages, as long as you're over 18, are welcome. Please take the survey at stigmasurvey.org. Thank you for listening to the Untoxicated podcast. You've got this, and we've got you.